Hi guys, here I'm going to show you how to force a user to enable macros in order to use the workbook. So it's going to work like this. You have your lovely splash screen here, that's what it's called, and it tells the user, please enable macros, even you, Karen. And you go up here, hit the enable content button, and then voila, there we go. We can now use the workbook regularly, do whatever we want with it, and when we close it and reopen it, if macros are not enabled, we'll see that splash screen again. If macros are enabled, it'll immediately go here and they will not see that screen at all. They may not even know that anything was happening in the background. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. Now, in order to force the user to enable macros, we, interestingly enough, need to use some macros. So what I'm going to do here is, since I've just shown you how it works, is I'm going to go to the macro itself and I'm going to explain step by step every little piece. Now, if you don't want to watch the entire tutorial, just download the file from teachexcel.com and you'll have the macro there and it's ready to go. Okay, so here we just have two worksheets, nothing special. I've used these in previous tutorials, and you don't have to have the ribbon hidden. I just had it done like that because it looks better for the splash screen. All right, let's hit Alt F11 and go to the VBA window and get started. So there's a couple of interesting topics that we're going to be using here. And first off, this is the macro, or a series of macros, heavily commented, and this is what we're going to go through. So let me make the text a bit larger and let's get into it. Now, this series of macros, they're a little bit different than a lot of macros that you may have previously seen. We don't have them in a module. So you don't have a module over here. We have them, in fact, in this workbook. So if you double click this workbook, you're going to get a little window that looks like the module window, and that's where you can paste this code. So if you download the workbook, you could just copy everything from here and then open up this workbook in your own workbook and paste it in there. Now the reason we need to do that is because we have two things that run here based off of what's happening with the workbook. So let me quickly explain how this works. We have actually three worksheets. Over here you can see the welcome worksheet and then our regular worksheets. You can have as many worksheets as you want, but you need one that is the splash screen or the welcome screen. And this series of macros, what it does is it hides all of these other worksheets except for the welcome screen when the user goes to close the workbook. That way, when they open the workbook again, they can only see the welcome screen. That's the only worksheet visible. And once they turn the macros on, the macro says, okay, I'm on now. What do I need to do? I need to hide the welcome screen, and then I need to show all the other worksheets so the user can use them. So that's how it works, and we need to use two sort of events, and those events are based on the workbook opening and closing. So here we have one at the top. I should have put workbook before open up here, but we have workbook before close. So this macro runs essentially when the user goes to close Excel or click the X or close any other way. This macro is going to run right before the workbook closes. This one down here, this one runs right when the workbook is opened, or right when the user enables macros after the workbook has been opened. So it won't run if macros aren't enabled. You can't actually programmatically force Excel to turn macros on. That would be a massive security issue. And now down here, so I could have put all the code just within these two guys, but down here underneath them, what I've done is I've broken them out into two little baby macros. One to show our sheets, all the sheets that we want to work with, and hide the welcome worksheet, and another one that will do just the opposite, hide all of the sheets and then show the welcome screen or the splash screen. And actually, before I get into these little macros, I want to show you how to see all the events for the workbook. I'm not going to cover this in this tutorial, but it's helpful. So when you're in this workbook, when you double click it and go over here, look to these two drop-down menus. Click the left one and go to Workbook, and then click the right one over here, and you have all these different options. So this is how, or all of these different things allow you to do something when someone does something in Excel. as it relates to the workbook. So you can also do this with the sheets if you double click the sheets as well and get specific events specific to that worksheet. For instance, before you click save or after you click save, you've got this. So after you click save, but before it actually goes to save, you've got that, and you have a bunch of cool stuff before printing. And this is actually really fun to play around with when you get a little bit more advanced with your macros. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the baby macros first. Concepts are a little bit easier to digest, and then get into these before close and before open macros. So let's go down here to, let's see, show sheets. This one's pretty simple. So here we have the comment, show all worksheets except the splash screen, and a very important note, show worksheets before hiding the splash screen. You must always have at least one worksheet visible at any time in Excel. So if you want to cause an error, you can go down here and where it says hide the welcome screen, you can put that above this where it loops through to show the other worksheets. Because at that point, it will not have any worksheets visible in Excel. So that may seem a little bit confusing, but just know that the placement is very, very important. You must always have one worksheet visible at any moment in Excel. So we can't hide all of them at once. So that's what we do. We loop through the worksheets and we show them. So here we go. We loop through the worksheets. Very simple for each loop. I've talked about this in previous tutorials. So what we've got here is, I don't think I declared the variable, nope. Okay, is sheets is a special word. It basically means that it holds all of the worksheets in the Excel workbook. And when we do it like this, for each, it's going to loop through all of the sheets in the workbook. And when I type WS here, that's just a variable name. You could put whatever you want there. You could put blue sky, red Ferrari, whatever you want. Just a variable name. So what it does is it loops through the sheets, and for each sheet, the WS is now going to refer to that specific sheet. So we have 3 sheets. The first time this loop runs, WS will be equal to, let's say, the welcome sheet, sheet 1. The next time it runs, it'll be equal to sheet 2 and sheet 3, and so on for all of the worksheets. So since WS is equal to the current worksheet that is being looped through, we go down here and we check which one it is. We check if it's the splash screen or the welcome screen. And we do that by using the name property. So here we're referencing that worksheet. And then we type name to get the name of it. So this is the visible name in the tab. Now I named my splash screen welcome. Oftentimes you may just see it listed as splash screen or splash. But I like the word welcome. So welcome. So we see if the worksheet, and this is the does not equals operator or sign comparison. It's a less than and a greater than sign back to back. That's what it is. So you type both, bam, bam. So if the worksheet does not equal welcome, then let's do something. Okay, I need to change this note here. Hide the worksheets. Okay, I put the notes in a little bit last minute here. So if it does not equal welcome, if it's not our splash screen, go ahead and hide it. To do that, we reference the worksheet, then we reference its visible property, and then we set it to Excel sheet visible. So that makes it visible. Cool, easy peasy. So that's all this does. And then down here, next, just says go to the next worksheet, go to the next, this right here, oops, that right there, and that right there are all the same. They have to be spelled exactly the same variable name. So we go through the loop, again to the next worksheet. If it's not the welcome screen, we're going to show it, and then so on and so on. Goes through all of the worksheets. Let's go down. Now that we have shown all the worksheets, everything will be visible, and the welcome screen will also be visible, so don't forget to hide the welcome screen. So we reference that in a very simple way. We type sheets, we type the name of the welcome screen, the name, visible name on the worksheet tab. We reference the visible property, and this is important. We set it to Excel sheet very hidden. So very hidden means that when we go back to the window, back to the Excel window, when I go down here and right click, unhide will not appear. So if I hide this worksheet right now, I can go down here, right click, go to unhide, and unhide the worksheet. But when the worksheet is Excel very hidden, you cannot do that. That means that the user is not going to be able to very easily show the splash screen. So it makes it a little bit of a better user experience. If you want to show the welcome screen so you can work on it later, that's very, very easy to do. So go to the VBA window, Alt F11, go up here, click the welcome screen. Then I'm going to make this a little bigger. Go down here to the visible property. Let's click the drop down. And we have three options: Excel sheet visible, Excel sheet hidden. That's the default hidden setting that you can do when you right click the tab. And it might be off screen a little bit, Excel sheet very hidden. So I could do Excel sheet visible, go back to Excel, and now we can work on our splash screen and this really odd, creepy looking smiley face that I made. So let's go back here. Let's keep it at Excel sheet very hidden. Okay. Now, the next thing for showing our worksheets, this is a very important thing. Everything else is pretty standard. You're going to see it all over the place. This particular thing is very, very important to get this working, and it's kind of interesting. So what we're going to do, so when you hide or unhide worksheets in Excel, Excel says, okay, a change was made to the workbook. That means that if a user closes the workbook, I need to ask them if they want to save the workbook. However, we want to create a seamless experience for the user. So we don't want them to see the going from the splash screen to here and the hiding and back and forth as long as they have macros enabled. So if they open the workbook, they do nothing with it, and then they go to close, and they see this dialog that says something changed, do you want to save it? It's going to kind of confuse them. So what this little dude right here does, reference the Active Workbook, the saved setting, and set it equal to true. That says, okay, yeah, we unhid a bunch of sheets up here, and we hid another one, but don't sort of register that as a change that needs to be saved. So let's set the saved setting to true. Yes, everything has been saved. Everything is good. Don't worry about it. And that's what allows us to avoid this save dialog when we don't want it. That can be kind of confusing. If you want to figure out how it works, just put a little comma in front of it, single quote, open the workbook, don't do anything, close the workbook, and you'll get the save dialog. Remove it, it'll go away. And that may help you understand it a little bit better. And this is the only place where we change the Active Workbook.saved setting. So let us go and do the hide sheets. Hide sheets is basically the reverse of show sheets, but there are a couple things to note. So actually, there's almost nothing to note. I take that back. So remember, we have to have always one sheet visible at a time, at any given moment. So the first thing that we need to do is to show the welcome screen. You always want to do your showing before you do your hiding when it comes to this kind of macro. So we reference the welcome sheet, set the visible property to Excel sheet visible. Now we just do the reverse of what we did in the last macro. We loop through all the worksheets. Here we make sure it's not the welcome screen, and we go down and change the visible property to Excel sheet very hidden. So really the only difference is here we have no Active Workbook.saved. We don't need to deal with that. And we show the welcome screen before we hide the worksheets. Up here, dealing with the welcome screen happened after the loop. So two very simple macros. Now let's go to what makes everything work. Okay. So let's start with Workbook Open. Top of Workbook Open, and before close, I have little message boxes. They're commented out now, but if you uncomment them and then you do something that would trigger this to run, like go to close the workbook or open the workbook, the message box will pop up and you'll then see visually when the macros are going to run. So I left that in there. It's kind of a helper. It's kind of nice. It sort of, helps to wrap your mind around when things are happening. So when dealing with events, when dealing with a macro that's going to run when something happens in the workbook, you want to make sure you don't cause a loop. Very important thing, application.enableEvents equals false. Turn it off at the top. It's not going to matter so much in this case, but if you have a macro, for instance, that runs every time you want to save the workbook, and it also saves the workbook, then it could keep running and running and running, or a macro that changes a cell in the worksheet, and then you have a macro that runs when a cell in the worksheet is changed. You can create some loops, and it's really annoying. So it's a good idea inside things like workbook open, workbook before close, anything in this workbook and sheets that runs when something happens, the user does something in the workbook, go ahead and put enable events equals false at the top of it. And then just to speed things up, because we don't need the user to see us hiding and unhiding these worksheet tabs, you do application.screen updating equals false. It makes it so that when anything changes in Excel, you don't see it. So we go ahead and we turn both of these off at the start of the macro, and then at the end of the macro, we turn both of them on. And right here, we call our show sheets macro. Very simple, just type call and type the name of the macro. So what this is doing right here is it's saying, okay, when the workbook opens and macros are enabled, or after the workbook opens and then the user enables the macros, we're going to run. We're going to turn off screen updating. We're going to turn off events. And then we're going to show all the worksheets that we want to show and then hide the welcome screen. Then after that, we're going to turn screen updating back on by setting it to true and turn enable events back on by setting equal to true. That's all that's happening. Super duper simple. So now let's take a look at workbook close. Here it gets a little bit confusing. The macro itself is small, but the concept can be confusing. Okay, there we are. Since this is going to run when the user initiates an action, let's go ahead and turn off events. Let's go ahead and turn off screen updating because we're going to hide worksheets. They don't need to see that. Okay. Now, here we go. So, remember I told you about Active Workbook.saved and how when we open the workbook and then we show all the sheets, we're going to set the Active Workbook saved.saved value equal to true. That way, Excel will think that it has been saved, even though it has not been saved. So what we're going to do right here is to capture this value. If, and this is a one-line if statement, by the way, so if you're new to this, it's super cool. If you want to do something really simple, you can just do it like this. If, then your condition, then the word then, and then whatever you want over here. So if this workbook dot saved, I used Active Workbook earlier, but you can use this workbook here. If this workbook dot saved equals true, then set the value of this variable WB saved equal to true. And okay, I did not declare that variable. You could declare variables, you don't have to. It's not the end of the world. And if you don't understand that last statement, don't worry about it. So we set this variable equal to true so that we can access it in a moment. Now the reason that we do this here is because we want to do it before we hide the worksheets. Remember, Excel sees hiding and showing worksheets as a change that was made, which means that when you make a change, Excel on its own will change the save value or the state of saved. So when Excel is called to hide the sheets right here, it's going to say that this workbook has not been saved. It'll change it to false so that it knows to offer you a dialog to save your workbook. So we want to check it before we hide the worksheets. We want to save that value. Then we want to go ahead and hide the worksheets. Okay. Now down here, we can check our saved value, WB saved, if it equals true. So if it equals true, we want to go ahead and save the workbook. Now I'm going to try and explain the logic here. It can be a bit difficult to follow, but let's go through it. Okay? You open your workbook. Your macros are enabled. It shows all the worksheets, okay? Then we set it Active Workbook.saved down here. Active Workbook.saved. We set it equal to true. Even though it's not true, it's not saved, changes were made, right? Worksheets were shown. We set it to true, so Excel thinks everything has been saved, okay? Now, it's true. Let's say we go to close our workbook immediately. This guy runs up here. It checks if this workbook has been saved, which will evaluate to true. We store that in WB saved. Then we go and hide the worksheets. Excel is now going to have the saved value set to false. It will do that automatically for you so that it knows that changes were made. But since WB equals true, that means that the user made no changes, because from the time they opened the workbook to the time they went to close it, this workbook.saved remained true. So no changes were made. So we simply hide the worksheets and then we save it. And we need to save it because hiding the worksheets is a change, and if we don't save it now, it'll prompt the user to save a change which they didn't even know was made. Okay, and this is where it's kind of confusing, I guess. Now let's go through the other two scenarios. The user opens the workbook, the sheets are shown, active workbook.saved value is set to true. Okay. They make a change in the workbook, they edit some data, they do anything, then they hit save, then this workbook, once again, this value will be set to true. So it hides the sheets, which requires us to save the workbook again, and then the workbook is saved. Okay. Or they open the workbook, they make a change, and they do not save that change, and then they go to close the workbook. Well, in this case, this workbook.save will equal false. So WB saved will not equal true. It'll equal false. So we're going to hide the worksheets. Okay. And remember, they haven't saved their changes yet. Then this does not equal true. So we do not save the workbook. So this macro finishes and the user is asked if they would like to save their changes, which is the behavior that they expect, because they are going to close the program before they have saved changes that they themselves made to the workbook. I think I covered all the scenarios. It's very confusing to think it through, and it's kind of amazing how simple the code, if I removed all these comments, ends up being given the scenarios that you go through. But the last thing here is just turn events and screen updating back on. So with all that explanation, I tried to include most of it here in the macro. It can be kind of confusing. Honestly, the only thing you really have to change if you want to get it to work for yourself is, where are these guys? Change welcome to the name of your welcome worksheet or your splash screen. But yeah, I hope you're at least starting to get a slightly better understanding of how these macros are working. And I hope that my explanation was helpful here. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.